But I think, internationally we're going to continue to see more of that, and I think domestically we're going to see more of that as well as technologies move forward and people start to understand both risks and benefits.
Joe, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the researcher's responsibility. So Craig is sort of right and sort of not showing the whole scope. So Indigenous people do have this unsiloed, it's called relational accountability, this unsiloed set of values that kind of put together all of knowledge, right? But that's not unique to us. I mean, Plato and Aristotle started out, and that's the way they started out, and then because it's just easier to teach things separately, things have been siloed all the way to Isaac Newton. But during the Renaissance, Da Vinci and others did the opposite, and they put everything back together. And so we're in that era, and I've been a scientist since 1990. And I've heard lots of scientists, because they're nerds, say, I'm doing my work. They're kind of like artists, they're a painter or a musician. They only want to produce good work. That's what they're interested in. They want to do their good work, and they don't care about the consequences. And I've heard that even as recently as 2015 with the TopMed program in DC. They just want to do good work, what society does with it, but you can't do that anymore. Disruptive technologies like cloud computing and cloud storage, CRISPR technology, omics, and then what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, that is not a luxury that any scientist has anymore. You live in the era of big data, and your data is going to go everywhere very quickly, and you don't know who's going to see it, you don't know who's going to use it, so you don't have the luxury to say, this isn't my purview anymore. You all have the responsibility to say something and try and create a system that's trustworthy.
Before I think we get to audience questions, I just want to give each panelist maybe a brief opportunity to tell the audience what you hope they keep in mind throughout the rest of today. Craig, can you get started? Throw you on the spot.
Well, I think I've spoken to that pretty much. I really think that these kinds of conversations are very important because the environments we're in often dictate what kinds of conversations are allowable or what kinds of conversations can happen. And I think we have to work to create environments where all kinds of different viewpoints are allowed to infiltrate the space, and that we do diligence and deliberation in terms of some of these very, very difficult questions. It's very easy as an academician to not go there with some of these very difficult questions, but I think it's part of all of our responsibilities.
Just to tag on to that, in communicating with families and just working with the individuals affected by the diseases that we were studying, I often found myself saying, this is really hard, what we're trying to do here. It's very complex, but it is ever more important that we do this the right way. The right way, that again, up for significant discussion and debate. I guess my hope is for translational medicine to address those that are currently unseen and have unmet needs. But my concern in how we get there is equitable access to information. I think what was being touched on by Joe was, proper informed consent on these technologies, which is very difficult to achieve. And we're quite privileged to be able to have this discussion here and to be exposed to this type of content. But certainly it's not the case in other places around the globe. And so again, that equitable accessibility is really important to be successful.
Yeah, I think that there really is a lot at stake with this, both in terms of the potential for these technologies to solve some of our trickiest conservation and biodiversity problems, as well as the potential to create more problems. And I think, the main thing I would say is that we need to be having more of these conversations, and we need to be talking openly about the risks and the benefits. And we need to be making sure that the conservationists and the geneticists and the gene editing technology manufacturers are having these conversations together, and including the communities who are affected, and we're being open and honest about it.
I'm hoping for these technologies, not just CRISPR, but omics in general, to lead to more social justice. So we're hearing in this next election cycle about African American reparations, and of course nobody wants to do that because nobody wants to sacrifice their salary, their house, their land, their car. But with these technologies, you don't have to do that. If you already build in something for Native Americans, African Americans, anybody who's been a victim of colonization, if you build it in where they have a piece of it, then you don't have to do reparations, because if you really believe in the technology and that it's going to be successful, then it's going to be successful for you and it's going to be successful for them.
Yeah.
We're showing the top questions. Kelly, I'll let you field those, and then I'll offer you some that may not be showing up on screen, but that might be of interest to talk about. So go for it.
Yeah, I guess we did spend a lot of time talking about sort of the potential pitfalls and landmines, but what are the greatest areas of promise? I know, Michelle, we talked about the ability to potentially treat or cure rare diseases, to address diseases that we don't even maybe know about yet, or haven't even begun to try to attempt. And Aviva, you spoke a little bit about helping maybe prevent species extinctions, or I think we didn't get into maybe thwarting invasive species. So could we maybe spend a couple of moments talking about really these areas of great promise?
Happy to take a start at that. So with the emerging of gene editing, now we're seeing this taking place in clinical research. And so we heard recently, within the last month or so, of sickle cell disease trial results in an individual named Victoria Gray, who is reporting that post-administration, she's relatively pain-free, which is significant in her life and those affected by sickle cell, because it is exceedingly painful. Dependence upon opiates to just move through the day is rampant. So we're starting to see some of the benefits, and as more move into clinical research, I guess it's a wait and see. But we're seeing it now.
So I think I touched a little bit on this in the beginning, but in terms of the applications, there's just so many when it comes to conservation. Endangered species are certainly one of them, helping endangered species survive climate change or other environmental stressors. Invasive species are another area that there's been a lot of focus on. Invasive species are one of the major threats to wildlife. And so using gene editing to be able to control an invasive population could be a huge way to benefit native species. Wildlife diseases is another major area that could be affected by gene editing, and could figure out how to solve some of those problems. Think about like microplastics in the ocean. Can you gene edit some microbial species to be able to eat those microplastics and solve those kind of problems? There's just a ton of examples out there of some of these technologies and how they could really benefit conservation and biodiversity.
Tagging off of one of these questions here, I mean, gene editing is nothing new, right? We've been gene editing for a long time using different technologies. So what's different about CRISPR?
Well, I think, the way the question is framed, there's not that much fundamentally different, other than the precision, accuracy, and immediacy with which the technology offers us. But again, I want to go back to the thinking that guides appropriate use of the tool. And I want to encourage us to think about this framing of the rights of nature. And let's talk about CRISPR within the context of a rights of nature framework. And that would allow us the opportunity to deliberate, rather than often the way inculcated in my thinking is this idea of humans subjugating nature, or having control over nature, or having dominion over the natural world. Those are all cultural constructs that are deeply embedded, at least for me, not only within my conscious but my subconscious. And so it takes a little bit of deliberation to start to challenge that and think about that differently.
I think the difference is the pace, the access, being able to have a lot more people, out of their garage working on this technology, releasing gene-edited organisms because they have access to this technology. I think that's the difference. It's not not fundamentally that it's such a bright line between GMOs and gene editing. I think it's the pace, it's the scale, and it's the access.
I think the next session will probably deal with some of this, but what are some of the ways we can engage the public on conversation about CRISPR? It's one thing for all of us to sit in a room and discuss it, but the people who are really sort of the beneficiaries maybe, and maybe in some ways the victims of gene editing if we don't do this correctly, how do we get word to them and involve them in the conversation?
So there are groups already trying to take this on. I am aware of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine has a foundation, and one of their initiatives is public education on these fields, and they've done some polling. I'm awaiting some of the research results because I'm very interested to hear really what the current assessment or beliefs are. My understanding is that they've really tried hard to get a spectrum of opinions. But my thought, and I don't mean to make light of this, but my thought is that I don't think we want for Dwayne Johnson, who I'm a fan of, to educate the public on our behalf about gene editing. And of course, I'm referring to one of his films, Rampage, that I did happen to watch, and it was, if that was my only exposure, I would have significant fears and concerns, of course. So.
Sounds like we all need to do some homework if we haven't seen the movie.
I'm part of a couple of different large indigenous research groups. One is called the Center for Ethical Indigenous Research, Indigenous Genomic Research, which is a 3-site collaboration between Alaska, Oklahoma, and South Dakota. And what we've been doing, if you haven't heard of deliberative engagement, it kind of got really kick-started after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans because there wasn't a government anymore, so the community had to figure out how to spend this FEMA money. Anyway, we've been doing the same thing with these large genomic questions. So surveys and focus groups, and they have problems with bias, and they have a bigger problem with community level education. Deliberative engagement avoids all those because you have more than one expert in the room giving more than one side of the story, and then those people leave the room, so that bias is taken out. And then the community themselves basically go through a series of polling questions to get to a public policy recommendation. And in the whole time, they're learning about the topic, especially the parts that they don't know about the topic, and if they choose to, they can call in whatever expert back into the room and describe whatever it is that they're asking, and then that person leaves again. And so it's really been a very beautiful and successful way to not only teach the community about these things, but then get their real opinion, where a survey is biased because you, the researcher, are creating the survey, right? And then if it's a focus group, it's you, the researcher, that are giving your opinion during the presentation. And so that avoids a lot of these problems. And I think that if more people do that with CRISPR, it kind of like a town hall, but just around the country, it would get a better idea of what people feel about it.
Again, that gets to attending to the quality of the space so that those kinds of deliberative engagement conversations can happen.
I think another part of engaging the public is making sure that there is transparency and understanding of what technologies are out there, and also having meaningful opportunities for public engagement through the regulatory process. I don't think that exists now, but I think that is a crucial part of this discussion.
Great. And as promised, I'm going to ask some questions that may not have had the top ranking, but maybe bring a different kind of flavor to the conversation. Here's kind of a hard-hitting one. How can we legitimately talk about equity in technology with such a non-diverse audience? Joe can't represent all the non-white people in the room. How do we talk about equity? Who wants to take it?
Well, I'll take it. We can't. But we can start a conversation here. And again, on my credits is the Cultural Wellness Center, and we do something there called cultural self-study, where we study ourselves, we study our own biases. We try to make implicit biases explicit so we can put them on the table and ask, is this something I want to hold on to as a resource, or is this something that needs to be transformed? And so it's very important for those of us who are in positions of authority and decision-making power to be able to understand the culture that we bring, understand the subjectivity that we bring with us into the issue. And I think that's absolutely critical in terms of helping us to transform the space so that others feel like they have, they belong in the space.
All right, I'll offer one more. There was a question about how we bring nuance to these conversations. How can we respect the no thank yous while also providing access to the yes pleases? So I'll leave you with that one, and then we'll go back to some of the top rated ones.
I'm not sure. So how do we make sure that we're serving it up so that if people want to, they can partake? Or
the question just was, how do we bring nuance? How do we respect the folks who are saying no thank you and provide access to those who say yes?
I like how you started out this particular conversation with just laying out some of those ground rules and saying this is how we'll have a respectful engagement and conversation. I think that more of human interaction could benefit from having and abiding by some of those ground rules. But this is just a pocket. This is a slice in time. I think what we're hearing is that we need to have more of these types of discussions, bringing in even broader diversity and people with different opinions to really be able to bring in that nuance. And I think then where does that stop? Where are we actually going to get to? That's going to be a challenge, because we have to at some point be able to call it and say, okay, we've gathered enough information. We have the ability to make a decision or recommendation, and now we have to proceed, because we do know is that science will iterate, people will evolve or adopt in some fashion or another. So when do we make that call? I think that's going to be very challenging to come to that realization.
Great. So, and this is open to anybody who has an answer, but who is currently regulating CRISPR and who isn't but should be? At least in the United States. And we can take this internationally too if relevant.
So my understanding is that it's a very piecemeal approach with different agencies having different pieces of the regulation. USDA regulating when it's like a plant pest, FDA when it's an animal, EPA if there's a pesticide involved, and not a more holistic single agency or clear structure that makes sure that all applications are regulated. I don't have the perfect solution of who should be doing the regulation, but I do think it needs to be less piecemeal than it currently is.
Yeah, I was at a LCCon in Connecticut a couple of years ago, and there was a Harvard attorney there who was talking, because they have the human patent. They were talking that their patent wasn't to exclude anybody or have any kind of commercial control over the patent. Theirs was mostly so that they can do this unofficial regulation. Since there isn't any regulation right now, their patent was a protective patent so that people wouldn't abuse it. And then she laid out, kind of their guidelines for use.
And so for clinical research, it is the FDA here in the US, EMA in Europe that are regulating.
With this question here at the top, are there ways to regulate CRISPR that don't stymie the benefits of the technology?
Yes, absolutely. maybe it involves a slightly slower pace, but I think that there are absolutely ways to structure regulation, to incorporate precaution, to incorporate risk assessment and remediation, and still move forward with technological benefits.
But there's probably not just one policy, right, that would achieve all of that.
It's not an easy thing to do, but I think it is possible.
Many of us are probably familiar with the backlash that has resulted from genetically modified crops, and you use company names like Monsanto, and that can trigger a reaction in some people. How can we avoid that same kind of backlash with CRISPR?
Well, to me, that was a breach of trust, the way that GMOs were pushed and promulgated, and even to the point of the way labeling issue was handled, that there wasn't enough deliberation, and there was this rush to commercialize the technology and alter our food system in ways that people didn't have a voice in. And so there was a level of distrust that was created that I think industries are still very much struggling with. And so I think trying to move ahead, building trust, and working with tools like deliberative engagement is a very important lesson for moving this technology forward in a way that more people will benefit and have a voice in.
And who's responsible for funding these risk assessments, particularly as it pertains to ecology? And I think we'll make this the last question. It costs money, right, to do these things? It
costs money. I think that there's a responsibility from government agencies who are funding this. I think it's also in the best interest of companies who are doing this work, if they want to avoid that potential backlash, to make sure that these things are incorporated. But it's not as sexy to fund ecological risk assessment as it is to fund the applications of the technology. So it is a challenge.
Thank you.
Well, there were a lot of great questions coming through the app. You'll get to see all of them in our post-event report out. Thank you so much to our panelists, to our moderator for kicking off CRISPRcon with this great discussion. More to come to build off their remarks. Let's thank them all. Thanks.